Well, Roland, I think of you as a man of the arts, and therefore I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the spiritual life and the role of art. Why don't you just tell me a little bit about your own interests in arts? I know they're far-ranging. I see you at the concerts periodically, and I know you love the theater, and I think you've reviewed books on art and so on. So you had a wide-ranging interest.
Well, I think, Jim, it started in my family. My dad was a great museum goer, and my three brothers and myself, as we were growing up, very often Dad would take us off to art museums or science museums, all kinds of things. My mother was a good pianist. There was music in our home. And I just grew up loving music. It's always been really important to me. And then it was natural to go from that to art and to the other, the various other kinds of arts.
One of which is film, right?
Oh,
You've reviewed films a lot and like to do that.
I think I could be described as a film nut, and that would be accurate. Really, all of the arts. I can't think of a single one that doesn't appeal to me, and at times that doesn't speak to me. When I went on to college in the Oblates, we had some leeway about our majors when we got to the graduate level. So at Catholic University, I majored in music, have a master's degree in musicology, and the minor is in music education. And then later, as I began teaching a lot of English at the high school and college level, I went back to Notre Dame and got the equivalent of a master's in film study and with some English courses. So I didn't get the degree because I started puttering around. I took what I wanted in social justice classes. But I've always loved to study art, and found it enriching.
Well, it does have a definite connection with the spiritual life. And one way I'd like to look at that on this program has to do with the kind of culture we live in, a technological culture. We're sort of committed to the project of making money and of moving up the socioeconomic ladder. We are a very utilitarian culture, which suggests that we're often using things in order to achieve other ends. And I suppose in that way that very often our spirit does get deadened. Yeah. And that's a very real experience for people. People will talk about being involved in the rat race, and there's really no time to stop and to appreciate the beauty of the world. People often feel that. I sometimes think that's why people get involved in camping expeditions and so on, to be in touch with the beauty of nature, at least for a little while. I mean, what does it mean to walk around on asphalt all the time, or to be enclosed in buildings that aren't particularly attractive? I think there is a way in which the technological, utilitarian culture hurts our spiritual life or deadens our spirit in some way.
Sure. As you said that, I remembered a young girl in a program where I taught music. I guess it would be in the late 60s in Philadelphia, and it was I did it for several summers, and it was aimed at really poor kids, mostly coming from the ghetto. And I vividly remember one young girl, probably 9 or 10 years old. We'd have classes, and then we'd get them in buses quite often, take them out to the country or to the zoo and other places. And the first time that she arrived in Fairmount Park, there were acres of grass and of green. And she was terrified and started crying. She just didn't know that world and thought that there was something wrong if you didn't have concrete all around. And it just struck me at the time as extraordinarily sad that her world was so, it was concrete world, it was, she was anesthetized in many ways to the potentialities of life.
Well, that's a powerful example. And of course, even in its striking form, perhaps it touches home to the rest of us too. We might not get terrified when we see a green park, but on the other hand, we have to wonder, what does it mean to us to live in a technocracy, a culture that is so bound up with the useful and with technique in order to accomplish things?
I remember a Baptist preacher named Langdon Gilkey who wrote an essay, and one of the sentences in that, which deals with what we're talking about, says, "A technical culture is voracious, turning everything into a means." That we live in a culture where everything becomes a means to make money, a means to do something. And what the arts do at their very best say, no, it doesn't have to be a means to something else. This is beautiful in itself, and it's worthwhile. And I think that is profoundly spiritual also.
And, of course, most important then to our spiritual development, which is the slant we're taking here, isn't it? That the claim is that the world of the arts and putting us in touch with beauty will enable us to come closer to God, to develop our inner sense of things, and to become more complete and integral human beings.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit, Roland, about how that all works and so on, and how the arts do that. I mean, the arts put us in touch with beauty. Beauty becomes an extremely important category, doesn't it, in all of this? You know, it's often said that the traditional scholastics talked about reality. They said reality has sort of universal characteristics. They called them the transcendentals, and they talked about truth and goodness and unity. And what the fourth of the traditional transcendentals was beauty. The suggestion that beauty was an aspect of reality itself. And well, we can clearly see that when one would look up into a starry night and get a sense of God's presence that way. Van Gogh's painting, that title might help us to appreciate that more, but there is God's handiwork that we call nature that gives us a whole different sense of things. So that beauty becomes, I think, a really vital category in thinking about human life and what it's all about.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think one way to put it would be that we conceive of God as the author of all beauty. God is the ultimate beauty. And the beauty that we encounter in life, whether it's in the world of nature or in a Van Gogh painting or in a symphony by Mozart or whatever, that experience of beauty, limited as it is, points somehow toward the eternal and the infinite beauty that God is. And so I see that as the connecting point, that to experience beauty on earth and to get away from some of this drabness and wasteland kind of world that we live in, to get to that area of beauty is to get God and have contact with God. And
you know, sometimes when I go to New York City to teach in the summers, I teach at Fordham, and I often think of those times as personal retreats for me. Right across from the campus at Fordham there, the Bronx Botanical Gardens, and most days I would go for a walk there and just try to drink in what was happening. But then there were other aspects of this retreat I would go on, like going to the theater, and where, again, there would be something else happening. I often felt of it like my spirit is being enriched this way, or to go to a concert. Of course, New York City is so rich with all of that, so it's sort of interesting, right in the midst of this great concrete and the utilitarian capital of the world, in a sense, you find the arts flourishing, and of course all these marvelous opportunities to have one's spirit recreated. But that was my own image of being in New York like that, as a time of spiritual renewal, and I often can almost feel that inside of myself. It's like some part of me comes alive again in a new way. I find what happens very often is I will start to get more creative ideas, or I'll think of things I want to write in an article, or something I want to do in a lecture. It sort of comes unbidden, and it's like a gift, but I feel like what is nourishing it is this experience with the world of art that the city provides. I don't mean you don't have to go to New York City to do that, but I'm just saying out of my own experience, when I go to teach there, I often use the city that way.
Well, it's the best place that I've ever found for that kind of thing, the arts. And you think of Broadway, you think of the great museums they have. I love opera, for example. Well, it's a city with two great opera companies, and then with many smaller ones. The richness of life and the diversity there is exhilarating. It is a wonderful retreat. And that doesn't deny, I'm sure some people will, having heard Johnny Carson jokes and so on, will say, you're talking about New York, the city of crime and of dirt and et cetera. Well, it does have that, but I think that's precisely why New Yorkers and the people that come there need the experience of beauty to be able to live with all of that and to be human and to keep their sanity.
Don't you think that in that way New York functions as sort of a metaphor and not just a reality? That it's a metaphor of what is possible artistically. In other words, in whatever setting you're in, I think it's possible to nourish the spirit artistically. I mean, to listen to good music, or to go to a local museum, or to read good literature. There would be all kinds of ways to sort of nourish that spirit that we're talking about. You used a word in there I found interesting, exhilaration, because I think maybe that's part of what happens, at least, in the art aesthetic experience, as we might call it here, the encounter with beauty. There's a way in which one is lifted out. Some people have talked about the ecstatic experience. We've often connected that with religious experience itself. That's one mark of religious experience, that we are lifted out of self, lifted out of the ordinary, placed in some other realm, in touch with the uncanny or the extraordinary, which can exhilarate the spirit. It seems to me that maybe that is one thing or one way of thinking about what beauty does for us.
It does, yeah. I remember in one of Thomas Merton's books that he makes a statement that the arts have the ability to make us find ourselves and at the same time forget ourselves. And it's that thing of being lifted out, and you're in touch with something much greater than yourself, which I would link with God and with the transcendent and with the divine part of who we are. But at the same time, you also find your identity, and you get grounded in another sense, and it does wonderful things for you as a person.
I like your two ideas there. You're lifted out of self, but you find yourself. Merton's fundamental sort of paradox, a typical Merton paradox, or a dialectical way of understanding life. And I think let's look at that forgetting oneself. Don't you think in the important artistic experiences when we encounter a classic work, that's part of what is happening, it seems to me, is that we are sort of lifted out and see things new. There's what we might call a disclosure that goes on.
Yes.
And of course what we would end up saying, and from this viewpoint of the spiritual life, is it's disclosing to us the mystery, the gracious one, the one we call God, and who, as you suggested at the very beginning, is the source of all beauty.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember in 1980 going to New York to the Museum of Modern Art, and I think you told me once that you saw this also, the Picasso exhibition.
Oh, yes, I did indeed. Yeah.
Absolutely incredible. A very large museum, and they took out all of their sculptures and paintings, except for the Picasso ones, took them somewhere else, and then brought in hundreds and hundreds of Picasso's works, so that I think it's the most complete exhibition that has ever been put together. The entire museum was filled with this man's work. And I remember spending about 4.5 hours there and really making that time, which wasn't nearly enough, by the way, but the human body has only so much energy, and I just got tired. But I stayed there as long as I could, walking through the entire collection the first time, and then going back and taking those things that I really wanted to concentrate on. And when I went out on the Manhattan street after that, I still remember that exhilarating is the word that comes to mind. It was thrilling that another human being in the same race that I'm in had done that. Now, I'll never do it. I'm not a painter. But I shared in that accomplishment somehow. It was a wonderful experience.
What was the phrase someone uses, that the artists are the antennae of the culture? They're the ones who really are tuned in. They know what's going on, or they see things more deeply.
Yeah.
Thinking of what one artist, I think, said, that he doesn't paint what he sees. He paints, and then that enables him to see. This is the artistic work opens up this other world for one.
There's a filmmaker, too, in the silent film era, whose name is escaping me now, one of the great directors, but I remember he has said many times over, my task is to make you see. And I think a great artist or a great film director does that. He even physically enables you to see the beauty in the world and to react to it more deeply and more intensely, and achieve this kind of ecstasy you mentioned, or exhilaration.
I'm thinking of the book that Jacques Maritain wrote called Art and Scholasticism, which influenced, I think, many people. And he says the artist is, first of all, the person who sees more deeply and discloses in the real spiritual radiances which others cannot discern.
Yes.
Spiritual radiances.
Yeah.
That's interesting, isn't it?
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's a way of saying that there's this the deeper mystery that is around, and the artist is able to somehow at least give us a moment of encountering it. Which might take us to another aspect of this thing, Roland, that because we're trying to see how our spiritual life ends up being somehow truncated or limited by living in a technological world. And what we're saying is it's very utilitarian, and it's hard to enjoy the moment because you're always looking to the future. You're doing something for the sake of something else. And it's almost like everyone lives that way all the time. You're going to keep working hard, work hard till you somehow retire someday and then enjoy life. I mean, it's the whole pattern of life as we know it. You always do. There's some future enjoyment out there that might never come. You might die before you ever get to that moment, but that's the way life works. And of course, when we're talking about the aesthetic experience, the experience of beauty, now we're talking about something that's engulfing in the moment. In other words, we're caught up in it now. So if you go to the concert and the music really touches your mind and heart, then you probably aren't thinking about anything else, but the experience of the moment is valuable in itself. That seems to be one of the main characteristics of beauty.
Well, another phrase of Thomas Merton comes to mind, where he said that in his little hermitage he often went out and listened to the birds singing or did other things like that because they were useless. And he says that's precisely what the aesthetic is in a profound way. It is useless if you judge it in terms of making money, in terms of piling up material kinds of things. But what you're doing in that experience of beauty is being human, and you are living. And life, then takes on a meaning. That's the end in itself, that moment with that music you're hearing that is so thrilling, or looking at that painting of Rembrandt, or whatever the experience is. That is being alive at that moment, and that's also being deeply spiritual, I think.
There's another phrase from our friend Jacques Maritain in Art and Scholasticism, and he's talking about poetry and music, he says, allows us to glimpse the splendors beyond the grave. Glimpse the splendors beyond the grave. And I think that's maybe the feeling that someone gets when they're caught up in the aesthetic experience.
What I guess theologians would call the transcendent, getting in touch with the eternal. And there's a phrase in one of Van Gogh's letters to his brother Theo. I recently read the entire collection, and it's one of the greatest documents I've ever read. It's his autobiography, and he's almost as good with words as he is with paint. And in one of the letters in 1882 to Theo, Vincent said, "There is in painting something infinite." That he said, what you put on that canvas and what these human hands accomplish, that has an infinite quality to it. I think all great art does. It takes you beyond the grave, as that quote says.
And of course, this fits in right with our Christian understanding of things, doesn't it? That really it is the finite that mirrors the infinite. That our whole sense is that the great mysterious God has incarnated self in our world. That's our meaning of incarnation. Means that God is in flesh, comes into carnis, is the word for flesh, so that it is made real and visible. So as someone said, Christianity is the most materialistic of religions. And that's true in a sense, because our sense is that God has taken on human flesh and that put grace into our visible material world. And so that sort of is a theological background to saying what the artists really are discerning is the truth of the matter. They're in touch with how it really is, and therefore when they're able to point that out for us, that the infinite is contained in the grain of sand or in the still life painting of the apple, then that really does touch into our Christian sense of things.
Oh, it does. Van Gogh would be a good example of that. He started out his early career when he was in his 20s, wanted to be a minister. And for about 3 years, he actually was a minister in Belgium to a very poor area with miners mostly. And during that time, he became so intrigued with the gospel, he gave away all of his belongings and his salary. And ironically, the church back in Holland that was sort of controlling it, when they heard about his action, says that's unbecoming a minister, that he gave away his belongings completely to the poor, and they took away his license as a minister. And he was 27 when that happened. He was so angry at institutional religion that he abandoned it and became a painter. And he actually became a minister with paint. I mean, he didn't change his ideals. He still cared about finding God. He still cared about helping the poor. And his early letters from that time to Theo are very much about painting ordinary things like the peasants. His first great painting was called The Potato Eaters. It's a very dark, simple painting of these peasants. But he said in the letters that if you know how to look, God is present in that house, and that my task as an artist is to find that divine presence.
That's amazing. It reminds me of the parallel between the artist and the theologian, in a way. The theologian verbally tries to give some expression to the gracious mystery without trying to exhaust it or pretending that it can be exhausted, and realizing that the language of theology only points to something that's always beyond our imagining. And in a sense, the artist, say the painter, is doing the same thing with color and form that the theologian's trying to do verbally.
Yeah, I think all great artists respect the mystery of life. They don't pretend that they can rationally explain it away. And in that sense, they're like theologians who, as you say, respect mystery, and especially the ultimate mystery, which is God.
Yes, so we're looking at how this nourishes our spiritual life. I mean, suppose somebody said, "Well, that's really great. That's right. I'm here working every day and taking care of the house and going off. I mean, how do I enrich my spirit?" I suppose one way, even on television these days, we find periodically there are very fine films that could perform this aesthetic function or draw us in to that deeper world. I mean, it seems like there would be a lot of ways if people really wanted to do it.
Well, here in Toledo, immediately I think of the Museum of Art, which is one of the greatest in the country. And to have that in a relatively small city is a tremendous gift. I mean, to visit that and actually take some time to look at the paintings is to do one's soul a favor, it seems to me. And also the
I like that phrase, Roland, to do one's soul a favor. That's a good one.
Yeah. Well, we need to do it because we spend so much time with that material. I think also of the Toledo Public Library and how I have benefited from it. They have a wonderful audiovisual section, for example, and just last week I took out the film Babette's Feast. Have you seen that one?
I have seen that. That is a remarkable film.
For me, it's
one could show it in relationship to studying the Eucharist, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely, or the mercy of God. One of the themes running through it, too, is that of the artist, because Babette is this wonderful chef who creates a meal that truly is a work of art. The final third of that film is one that I alternately laugh at and cry at. It is I think, a masterpiece of filmmaking. And it is about the ability of the artist to raise people out of the mundane and to get them in touch with what is eternal. And even it's a little church group that she cooks for who is puritanical, and before the meal they actually get together and pray that they won't taste the food and they won't be touched by the sensuality of it, but they are deeply touched by it.
That brings up sort of that religious sense. There's been times in which I think the fundamental Christian sense that God is incarnated grace and spirit in the material world has been sort of lost in the history of Christianity. We've had a lot of debates. We had the iconoclast controversy back in the 8th and 9th centuries that said, that the religious paintings, the arts, the icons, and so on were in danger of becoming idols. And periodically that debate has gone on. It's sort of a Hebraic sense that, well, you must be careful so that the images don't take over. The images could become too much. You could make idols out of them. Very often our Protestant friends think of us Catholics that way. We had too many statues and too many paintings, and that they clutter up the church, and they keep us from this sort of immediate presence to God. And of course, there's always been a Catholic sense, very different from that the world of art mediates God's presence to us. So we have while the Protestant world has been very good on the verbal arts, the word, and music's been very important. The visual arts seems to have been a stronger part of the Catholic heritage.
Yeah, I think so. That's really one of the things I love best about the Catholic liturgy and Catholicism in general. The great artists through the centuries who were Catholic, very much there has been a respect for the image and for the potentiality of arts as deepening our spirituality and deepening our sense of who we are. And
I was thinking, Roland, about that when I was in Moscow and visiting, there was a young woman there, a convert to Russian Orthodoxy, whose comment to me was, "Why are your Catholic churches so bare?"
Yeah.
And I couldn't help what culture shock it is for someone who spent his whole life hearing Protestants say, "Why are your churches so cluttered?" And so many images. And so it is interesting to hear it from a very different side, because the Russian Orthodox believe they have all these images around their church. The icons, you're surrounded by them, and the sense is the communion of saints, that you are in communion with all these people who went before you in offering worship to God.
Well, that's very much the theme of Babette's feast also, of the little Protestant puritanical sect, which is very austere, and they don't permit images, they dress simply and so on. And Babette, this French chef who is wonderfully gifted with food, you have the whole contrast of Catholic culture, emphasis on sensuality and all that kind of thing. And I think that film handles the contrast of that and that whole theme as well as I've ever seen it anywhere.
Of course, any religious tradition is going to have its own strengths. We're playing off Protestant and Catholicism here. We could point out how Protestantism has kept alive the musical arts within the church, and in a period of time when the Catholic community was not doing much at all that way, and we had lost a lot of the musical tradition and so on, and especially the congregational singing. So, well, Roland, we've been talking about our culture, which is utilitarian and has lost the sense of beauty very often, and suggesting that the aesthetic experience is crucial to the spiritual life. And I guess a number of ideas have emerged. One, that it is exhilarating to be involved in the arts, that it's ecstatic, it lifts us out of ourselves, it gives us sort of a new perspective on life, and maybe we find a new energy and so on. And in doing all that, what we really believe is that the artist is putting us in touch with those splendors beyond the grave, with the infinite that is in the finite, and in that way helping all of us to come closer to the one we call our God.